Hello. I'm going to read chapter 5 of my book on intercession. This is the first book on intercession. There are 3 volumes, and this one is subtitled Becoming the Person God Listens to. We're in part 2, and this is chapter 5. There's a quote from E.M. Bounds first. Spiritual work is taxing work, and men are loath to do it. True praying costs an outlay of serious attention and of time, which in flesh and blood do not relish. Chapter 5. Moses, the meekest man on earth. I've another quote from William Booth. The greatness of the man's power is the measure of his surrender. How did Moses become the great intercessor? How did this man change God's mind to spare a nation when God had decided to destroy it? What was the secret to his answered pleadings with God? Let me go through his life and see the preparation that he went through to become this mighty intercessor. It was Moses' obedience and meekness that enabled him to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, but it was his intercession that kept them. They would have been destroyed in the wilderness if it hadn't been for Moses and his intercession on their behalf. Hosea reminded backslidden Israel of their history, and it confirms this. It was talking about Moses. Hosea 12:13. And by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet he was preserved. Predestined. The first thing to note about Moses is that he was predestined. And all who ever obey God and fulfill his word are also predestined. I'm not talking here about a doctrine of any Calvinistic persuasion. I'm quoting the Bible. Those who are saved were chosen in him before the foundation of the world. Ephesians 1:4 says, according as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him. Jesus told his disciples that they had not chosen him, but that he had chosen them. They may have chosen to follow him, but he had personally called them as disciples. A follower will never fulfill God's plan, for God cannot work with slothful, undisciplined people. Only a disciple can fulfill the will of God. Many are indeed called, but few are chosen. John 15:16 says, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give it you. Notice that if you bring forth fruit, you can ask what you want and God will give it you. Surely a key to intercession, bearing fruit. Moses was born, predestined, into the elect of God, Israel. And not only that, but he was the seed of Kohath, of the tribe of Levi, who were chosen by God to be the priesthood. The priesthood was not obtained by desire or by democratic vote. God decided who would be priests, and they had to be more separated, holy, than the rest of the children of Israel, who, as a nation, were called to be a separated people. Raised in Egypt. His life was miraculously saved from the genocide of Pharaoh when he was put in the bulrushes by his older sister Miriam. God arranged that he was brought up in Pharaoh's palace as a son of Pharaoh. When he was of age, he started the process that God had prepared for him, and to do the job that he was predestined for, to deliver and preserve God's people. Knowing both sides. To be an intercessor, an advocate, a person has to be able to identify with both the judge and the accused. Without a knowledge of the judicial system, an advocate will not know how to address the judge, and without knowing of the accused and the circumstances of him breaking the law, he cannot properly defend him. I will look at this in detail in subsequent volumes of this series. But we can see that Moses needed to understand the might of Egypt, the symbol of the world, as part of his training. This was a long training and took 40 years for him to complete. When this training in Egypt was complete, Moses began to seek his destiny outside of Pharaoh's palace. So he went to see his brothers, as he knew he had a destiny to deliver them from slavery. I'll read from Acts 7:23 to 25. And when Moses was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brothers would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them. But they understood not. We all need training. Notice that the above verse says that it came unto his heart. It was outside Moses, and obviously it was God who put it in his heart to fulfill his purposes. Moses was still working out of his flesh and not God's spirit, and he did deliver one Israelite and kill one Egyptian, but he had to flee into the wilderness because of it. This was all in God's plan for his development. He had, up to that point in life of 40 years, been finding out the might of Egypt, the world. Now he was to find out about God for another 40 years to complete his training as an intercessor. The wilderness is so necessary for a man of God to go through. He will never accomplish the will of God without this training. He will always act in the flesh, and like Moses, his effectual deliverance of God's people will be very little indeed. After 40 years in this second stage, he was now ready for God to use him. And God appeared to him in his holy mountain Sinai. Acts 7:30 says, and when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. Moses had been 40 years in the wilderness, and now God revealed himself to him. God does not reveal himself to carnal and undisciplined followers of Christ. We all have to go through this process if we really want to know God and for God to reveal himself to us. Moses was now ready for his mission in life. For at 80 years of age, he had become the meekest man on earth. What an accolade from God. He was ready not only to deliver God's people, but by his acts of intercession was able to preserve them in the wilderness, which I believe was much greater. Numbers 12:3 records, now the man of Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. When God called to him out of the burning bush and told him to go to Pharaoh, he said he had stammering lips. Did he have an impediment in his speech? Certainly not. He was the perfect man to go to Pharaoh, for he had known all the protocols of diplomacy and etiquette of the palace, and was trained in all the finery of a king. If you think he had a speech problem, you need to look at a scripture from Acts, which says the opposite. He was mighty in words when he left Egypt. What he had lost in the backside of the desert was his sophistication and confidence in his natural abilities. No wonder talking to sheep for 40 years. This is always a prerequisite for the ministry. The flesh can neither please God nor fulfill his purposes. Acts 7:20 to 22. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of Egypt, and was mighty in words and deeds. In the next chapter, I want to look at the intercession of Moses so that we can see the stages and progressions in his prayer to what is always the end desire of an intercessor, and we will find it is more than just getting our prayers answered.